I want to be clear about something before I start. I was not the right man for this. I was never the right man for anything that happened that week, and if there is a lesson buried somewhere in all of it, it is not the kind of lesson that flatters the person telling the story. I sold insurance in Glendale. I had sold insurance in Glendale for 11 years, and I was competent at it, the way a man is competent at something he fell into rather than chose, reliably, without distinction, without particular complaint. My biggest professional accomplishment in the 12 months prior to that Tuesday in October was closing a whole life policy on a retired dentist in Burbank who'd been putting off the conversation for 3 years. I coached my son's little league team on Saturdays badly, and I suspected my wife was sleeping with the milkman, which sounds like the setup to a joke, but is actually just the kind of thing that erodes a man quietly. The way water gets under concrete, not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow seeping that you notice one day when the foundation shifts. I was ordinary in the specific way that makes other people stop noticing you. A medium height, medium build, medium income man in a medium house on a medium street, in a city full of people who all believed they were something more than medium. I had stopped believing that about myself somewhere around year 3 of the insurance work, and I had made a kind of peace with it, the peace that looks like acceptance and feels, most days, like the quiet grief of a man who has decided not to grieve anymore. None of that mattered to the hegemony. That's what they called themselves in the end. Not to us, they never gave us a name for them. We gave them that one later in the classified documentation that most of the people alive will never read and that I am not technically supposed to know about. The hegemony. It sounds impressive, which is fitting because they were. But when they first made contact, when they first slipped a signal through our deep field telescopes and our radio arrays and every dish pointed at the right patch of sky on the right October night, they didn't announce themselves as anything grand. They just sent a message, clean signal, simple language, we are coming, we are bringing an offer, send the one you trust. The problem, as a certain very loud and very competent man explained to me in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, was that the one we trusted was dead. His name was Pirandello, Nick Pirandello. He stood in my kitchen eating my leftover pasta cold out of the container, my best Tupperware, as it happened, which he'd found in the second cabinet on the left without being told where to look. And he looked at me with the measuring gaze of a man who has spent 15 years assessing situations and people, and the distance between what's possible and what's available. He had dark eyes that didn't waste movements and a jaw that looked like it had been designed for a different purpose, and then adapted for a human face as a compromise. He moved through the world with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once in his life stood in a room and wondered if he belonged there. I had always felt that uncertainty. Every room, every occasion, every professional and social context, the low hum of wrongness, the sense that someone more qualified was about to arrive and take my seat. I recognized his certainty immediately, the way you recognize something you've been missing so long you've forgotten the word for it. He told me the world was ending. He told me this the way a man tells you something he has had to tell himself enough times that it no longer sounds strange to him, between bites of cold pasta, with the refrigerator still hanging open, because he hadn't bothered to close it after conducting what I can only describe as a culinary inventory. The world was ending in 5 years. Give or take. We had, and here he used a phrase I still hear sometimes in the 3 or 4 o'clock hour when sleep won't hold, we had poisoned the ocean. Not through malice, not through cartoon villainy or the deliberate cruelty of specific bad actors, though there were plenty of those to go around. Through the slow, grinding, entirely predictable accumulation of industrial negligence that is apparently the signature move of a species that has been telling itself it's intelligent for 10,000 years and has the mass extinction events to show for it. Something had gotten into the deep cold water, a compound, industrial in origin, persistent in the way that the most dangerous things are always persistent, not flashy, not immediately visible, just patient. It had been working its way up through the food chain at a rate that modeling teams at 7 different government agencies had agreed, in classified reports that none of them had been permitted to share with each other until 18 months ago, when someone in a room above my clearance level had finally forced the conversation, would reach criticality in approximately 60 months. Maybe 55. Maybe 62. The range of the uncertainty didn't matter much. The range of the outcome didn't vary. All life, not just us, everything with a heartbeat, everything with roots, everything that breathed and grew and reproduced and had spent 4 billion years figuring out how to do those things on a specific wet rock orbiting a specific yellow star. The ocean goes, everything goes with it. I said, that seems like something that would be on the news. He said, yes, you'd think. He closed the refrigerator. Then he told me about the hegemony. They had been watching. For how long, he didn't say, and I don't think he actually knew. The briefing documents were vague on the timeline in the way that classified documents are vague when the truth is either too strange or too humbling to commit to paper clearly. Long enough to see the problem developing before we did. Long enough to make a decision about what to do about it. They were not. This was important, he said, leaning forward with the fork in his hand like a man making a point in a faculty meeting. They were not here out of kindness. They didn't organize their thinking around kindness, or charity, or any of the softer motivations we tend to project onto things we don't understand. They thought in terms of the universe's long ledger, of balances and debts, and the question of what a given species might yet contribute to something vast and slow, and utterly beyond our current capacity to comprehend. They had run whatever calculations they run. They had looked at our record, the wars and the waste and the extinction events, and the particular talent we had for doing irreversible damage to things we depended on while telling ourselves we'd get around to fixing it. They had looked at that record and reached a verdict that I still find remarkable. Marginal case. Worth saving, but barely, and only under specific conditions, and only if we could demonstrate that the part of us that was worth something was real and not incidental. They were coming to make an exchange. What they wanted from us was simple to the point of deliberate insult. 1 glass of clean water. Earth water collected from an uncontaminated source, delivered by hand by a specific human at a specific location in Virginia at midnight on the last Friday of October. That was the price of salvation. A glass of water. I have thought about this a great deal in the years since, about the choice of currency, about what it means when a civilization capable of crossing the void and engineering molecular remediation solutions asks for a glass of water in return. I think they were making a point. I think the point was, we know what you have and we know what you've done with it and we know what you're losing, and we want you to hold it in your hand for a moment and understand what you're handing over. What they were offering in return was one of 2 things. The first option was what Pirandello called the good package, a remediation solution, engineered at a scale and precision that made our best chemistry look like a child's finger painting. Something that would propagate through the water column and neutralize the compound without secondary effects, without collateral damage, without the kind of unintended consequences that had gotten us into this situation in the first place. It would take 2 years to work fully. He was certain of this in the way only a man who sat through the classified briefings can be certain of something. The second option was what he called the big gun. I asked what the big gun did. He said it destroys half a planet. I sat with that for a moment. I waited for a clarification, a qualification, some additional context that would make it make sense. None came. He ate his pasta and waited for me to finish processing. After a moment I said, "Why is that an option?" He said, "Because some people in some offices decided a weapon capable of destroying half a planet was worth more than not dying." I understood it in the way you understand something that makes you feel faintly ill. Not emotionally, because the emotion hadn't arrived yet, just intellectually, the cold recognition that the world contained people whose internal calculus was that broken. People who had looked at the single most catastrophic threat in the history of the species, and had concluded that the correct response was to try to acquire a superweapon instead of the cure. I understood, in that moment, that Pirandello's next sentence was going to be that those people were trying to stop us. It was the agent who was supposed to make the delivery, a field officer who had spent 7 years building a relationship with the Hegemony's advance contact, who had been the face and voice and physical presence in every prior communication, whose specific biometrics the Hegemony had recorded and approved and filed under trusted. That agent was dead. Shot in a forest clearing during a dry run 3 nights ago. Inside job. The people who wanted the big gun had made their opening move with a rifle, and a man alone in the dark with a map. The Hegemony's terms were inflexible on the contact question. Their protocol required the delivery to be made by the approved agent, not someone with the same security clearance, not someone with the same ideological commitments, the same face, the same physical signature. They had established a relationship with a specific human body and would recognize any substitution, and their response to an unauthorized substitution was simply to leave. No renegotiation, no appeal. The offer expired, the ocean kept dying, and in 5 years all the leverage anyone had worked so hard to acquire would be academic, because there would be nothing left to apply it to. And here, Pirandello said, looking at me across my own kitchen table with those dark eyes in the fluorescent light of 11 o'clock at night, was the problem. The agency computers had cross-referenced every available database against the dead agent's biometric profile, and they had found exactly one match in the civilian population. He turned his phone around and showed me a photograph. Then he turned it back and looked at me. Then he looked at the photograph again. Then at me. He did this 3 times, not performing surprise, just genuinely still, after however many hours of knowing, unable to fully reconcile it. I looked exactly like a dead CIA field officer named Pillbox. Not similar, not a family resemblance or a case of common features. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same hairline, the same specific distribution of unremarkable features that apparently added up to the one face on Earth that beings from across the void had decided to trust. I said, "I'm an insurance salesman." He said, "I know." I said, "I coach Little League." He said, "I know." I said, "I have a 9-to-5 and a mortgage, and I haven't thrown a punch since." He said, "I know. Eat something, we're leaving in 20 minutes." I want to tell you I was brave about it. I wasn't. I stood there in my kitchen in the medium house on the medium street, and I was not brave in any way that deserves the word. I was frightened with the specific and total quality of fear that arrives when you realize that the universe has been running without your awareness or consent, that decisions of genuinely incomprehensible magnitude have been made by forces you didn't know existed, and that you, in your unremarkable life, with your cold pasta and your suspicions about the milkman and your adequate but unspectacular record at selling people protection against things they hoped wouldn't happen. You are the hinge on which everything now turns. But I went upstairs and I packed a bag. Because when a man stands in your kitchen in the middle of the night and tells you the world is ending and he needs your face, there is really only one thing to do, and I have never quite been able to explain why I knew that, only that I did. We drove through the night. His car was American and unremarkable and in flawless mechanical condition, which I would later understand was the precise description of Pirandello himself underneath everything he projected. He drove with the flat economy of a man who never wasted a movement. I sat in the passenger seat watching the city give way to freeway and freeway give way to dark, and I asked questions. He answered each one in the minimum number of words required, which was not many words, but they were always the right ones. The Hegemony's contact had established a relay point on the East Coast. The exchange location was a forest clearing in Western Virginia. The deadline was midnight on Friday. Today was Tuesday. We had 72 hours to move roughly 3,000 miles, keep me alive, and arrive at the right place in the right state with a glass of water from a specific Colorado aquifer that was currently sealed in a case in the trunk, clean, verified, uncontaminated, waiting to be traded for the continuation of all known life. I asked him what the hegemony looked like. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he'd never seen them himself, only the briefing documentation, and that the documentation was incomplete in the specific way that documentation becomes incomplete when the people writing it couldn't find adequate language. Humanoid, roughly. Bilateral. Our height, our general proportions. Faces organized around the same basic structures, eyes, nose, mouth, in a way that would read as a face from any reasonable distance. But the skin was not a color that existed on Earth, and the way they moved was something that no report had managed to describe precisely, only approximately. The way they held themselves and traversed space suggested something that had learned the mechanics of human movement without fully internalizing the reasons for it. Close enough to recognize, far enough off to make something in your gut file an objection. I asked if they were dangerous. He said, "They're the most capable thing that's ever paid attention to us." I said, "That doesn't answer the question." He said, "No, it doesn't. The first attack came at dawn on the outskirts of Barstow. I won't give you a complete account because the complete account is a blur of noise and motion that I've been reconstructing for years and still can't render precisely. 3 vehicles attempted to box us on the interstate. Pirandello identified the geometry of it before I understood what I was looking at, and he did something with the car, a combination of speed and angle, and a willingness to put a vehicle into positions the designers had not intended, that extracted us from the trap with a great deal of sound, and at least one other vehicle going sideways across 2 lanes of highway at a speed that should have been fatal and apparently wasn't. He wasn't frightened. I kept coming back to this in the days that followed, the fact that fear did not seem to be available to him as a response. Not because he didn't understand the stakes. He understood them more completely than I did and carried that understanding in a way that should have been crushing. But he was calibrated to threat the way a gyroscope is calibrated to motion. The worse conditions became, the more stable he got. The needle didn't move. I found this both deeply reassuring and, in some part of my brain that was still functioning on its normal frequencies, profoundly alienating, because what it told me was that he lived in a world where this was simply the texture of things, where men tried to kill you at dawn on the interstate, and you noted it and responded and filed it away and kept driving. I, by contrast, had my hands on the dashboard and was producing sounds that didn't resolve into words. He told me to get down. I got down. He told me it would be over shortly. It was over in less than 2 minutes. When I came back up, there was a hole in the rear window that had not been there previously, and Pirandello was at the speed limit, both hands on the wheel, face expressing nothing I could identify. He said, "You'll need to do better than that." I said, "I'm an insurance salesman." He said, "You've mentioned that." We stopped in Arizona when the first light was well up, at a roadside diner that smelled of burnt coffee and cooking grease, and the specific early morning quietude of places that never close and therefore never fully rest. Pirandello ate eggs in the efficient way he did everything. I drank 3 cups of coffee and tried to persuade my hands to stop shaking by an act of will, which didn't work but gave me something to focus on. He explained the structure of the opposition over breakfast. The faction that wanted the big gun had been building inside the agency for years, he said. The way things build when people with a particular ideology find each other slowly and carefully in institutions that reward caution. They had decided that a weapon capable of destroying half a planet was a strategic asset that outweighed the cost of losing the cure. They had done this math and arrived at this answer, and they were not stupid men, which was the part that was genuinely hard to hold. The men who were trying to kill me and stop the exchange were not stupid. They were intelligent, experienced professionals who had looked at the facts and built a complete and coherent picture of the situation in which their answer made sense. The values were wrong. The foundation was wrong. But the structure built on that foundation was sound, and that made them more dangerous than simple villainy would have. A waitress refilled my coffee without being asked, which is one of the small human courtesies that I was, that morning, disproportionately grateful for. She had gray hair and a practiced efficiency that reminded me of people who have been good at a difficult job for a very long time, and have reached the point where the skill is invisible even to themselves. She said the weather was supposed to be clear through Thursday. Pirandello thanked her. She moved on to the next table. I watched her for a moment. I thought about the scope of what was at stake, and the fact that this woman refilling coffee in Arizona at 6 in the morning had no idea, would never have any idea, that somewhere in the operational machinery of her government, men were making decisions about whether she and everything she knew would continue to exist. I thought about all the people in all the medium-sized lives across the country who were at that exact moment eating breakfast or sleeping or driving to work, operating in the reasonable assumption that the world was the world and would continue to be the world, and the fragility of that assumption, and the fact that its fragility was not their fault and was not something they could do anything about, and that the best thing you could do for them was to not let them find out how close things had come. Pirandello said, "You're starring." I said, "I'm thinking." He said, "Don't do too much of it. The thinking is mostly done. The work that's left is physical." He was right, and I knew he was right, and I went back to my coffee. He also told me more about Pillbox, the dead agent, the man whose face I wore through no choice of either of ours. He had spent 7 years in contact with the Hegemony's representative. 7 years of slow, careful, unglamorous relationship building, of showing up consistently with clean hands and clear intentions, of demonstrating through repetition and reliability that humanity contained at least one example of the thing the Hegemony needed to see. Pirandello said he had been a genuinely good man, not just effective. The word he used was good, and he used it carefully, the way men use words they don't deploy often. He said Pillbox had believed, without performance or sentimentality, that the species was worth saving, and that the way to save it was to show that belief in action rather than argument. 7 years of action, and then a rifle in the dark. Pittsburgh was where the root intelligence failed us. Pirandello had a contact there, a woman running a relay, part of a network he trusted in the way you trust a structure you've helped build. When we reached the address, she was absent and the equipment was still warm. Someone had been ahead of us. The leak in the operation was deeper than he'd mapped it. He cleared the building while I sat in the car, which was worse than being with him, alone in an alley in Pittsburgh with a sealed case, and a set of mental calculations that kept producing answers I didn't want. He came back with a document, and an expression that told me clearly what kind of document it was. They knew our general routing, not our exact position, but our trajectory, and they had people staged at the most probable Virginia crossing points. They had also, the document indicated, identified me as a substitute for Pillbox rather than Pillbox himself, which meant they knew more than Pirandello had believed they knew, and that the thing he'd been counting on, the element of operational uncertainty on our end, was gone. I said, "Is there a way through that doesn't go where they're expecting?" He said, "There's always another way through." I said, "Then let's find it." He looked at me for a moment. The expression was the same one I'd been trying to name since the kitchen, not the appraising look, not the tactical look, something else underneath those that kept surfacing and then going back under. He said okay, and we drove. Thursday afternoon, somewhere in the hill country west of the Virginia line, I stepped out of the car at a rest stop to move my legs, and a man in a state trooper's uniform came up behind me and put his hand on my shoulder and said very quietly that I should come with him. I was running before I finished understanding what I was doing. I grabbed his wrist with both hands. I don't know where the knowledge of the angle came from. some ancient information from a self-defense course I'd taken 15 years ago and retained in muscle memory rather than conscious recall. And I twisted, and his grip broke, and I ran across the parking lot shouting Pirandello's name at a volume that had never come out of me before. Pirandello was already in motion. What he did in the 12 seconds between my shout and my arrival at the car is not something I can reconstruct. What I know is that when I got there, the man in the not trooper's uniform was not a concern, and Pirandello was straightening his jacket with the matter-of-fact tidiness of a man who has just completed a routine task. He looked at me. The expression had surfaced again, clearer now. He said, "You moved fast." I said I was scared. He said, "That's generally why people move fast." That night we stopped outside Charlottesville, and for the first time in 4 days the crisis receded enough to leave room for actual conversation. We talked for a long time, not about the mission, about things that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with the people we were and the lives we'd built and the costs of both. He talked about 15 years of work at maximum efficiency in service of a purpose that was always slightly opaque to him, never fully explained, never quite visible from his position in the structure. The intelligence work was like that, he said. You were always operating on a portion of the picture, always extending trust in the direction of people and institutions who could see more of the frame and who may or may not have been using that advantage well. You got good at making decisions with partial information and at living with the decisions you'd made with partial information and finding out later what you hadn't known. Sometimes what you found out made the decision look better. Sometimes it didn't. You learned not to track the ratio too carefully. He didn't complain about it. Complaint wasn't a mode he had access to, or if he did he'd locked the access years ago and lost the key. But he described the shape of the life with a precision that told me he had thought about it carefully and at length, that he had turned it over many times in the particular hours that are available for turning things over, and that the thinking had produced something he'd made a kind of peace with rather than a peace that was genuinely restful. I told him about the insurance work, about the specific quality of sitting across from people on their worst days, after a death, after a disaster, after the phone call that divided their life into a before and an after, and helping them understand what their options were. About the fact that the work, done well, required you to be genuinely present with someone else's catastrophe, without either minimizing it or drowning in it, and that this was harder than people gave it credit for, and that it had taught me something about the difference between real fear and performed fear, and what to do when the real kind arrived. He said, "That's why you ran in the parking lot." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You knew what real fear felt like in your body because you've been sitting with it in other people for 11 years. So when it showed up in you, you recognized it as information rather than as a reason to stop." I thought about that, I said. I hadn't thought about it that way. He said, "The work shapes you whether you track it or not." We talked about Pillbox again. He told me things about the man that weren't in any briefing document, the quality of his attention in meetings, the way he handled uncertainty. The fact that he'd had a daughter roughly the same age as mine, and that this had never once appeared in his professional behavior and had never been absent from his personal motivation. He said, the reason the Hegemony trusted him was that what he wanted and what he said he wanted were the same thing. He didn't have a private agenda running underneath the stated one. He was transparent all the way through. In the work, that's rare enough to be remarkable. I said, "Do you think they'll know I'm not him?" He said, "Yes." I said immediately. He said, "I think they've known since Pillbox died. I think they've been watching everything since then, including this conversation." I let that sit for a while. Then I said, "And they're still holding the offer open." He said, "They're still holding it open." I said, "That means something, doesn't it?" He said, "I think it means they made a judgment about whether the thing they valued in him was specific to him or characteristic of the species, and their conclusion was characteristic." I said, they might be wrong about that. He said, they might be, but they've been watching us longer than we've been watching ourselves. I lay there in the dark after he fell asleep, and I thought about what was real in me. I thought about my kids and my house and the middle-sized life, and the fact that I had driven across the country with a glass of water and a man who fought like something out of a movie, because the world was dying and nobody else was available. I thought about my daughter's science project on ocean acidification that she'd done 2 years ago, the one where she'd been genuinely troubled by what she'd read, where she'd come to me, and asked if it was really as bad as the article said, and I had told her the thing you tell children when the truth is too heavy. I said we were working on it. We were working on it, with the particular quality that October mornings have in Virginia, the smell of old leaves and cold ground, and the sense that the year is counting down to something. Pirandello knew the approach terrain from satellite imagery he'd memorized rather than printed, and he navigated us to the forest from the north on roads that weren't on the main maps. Old hardwood country, the kind of growth that makes you feel the weight of centuries in the air quality, in the way sound moves differently through it, in the smell that has no city equivalent. We arrived 4 hours before midnight. He walked the perimeter twice while I sat on a log with the case on my knees and tried to inventory what I felt. What I found was this, not courage exactly, but a kind of resolution. The decision had been made. I had made it in my kitchen on a Tuesday night, and I had been remaking it at each rest stop and each Arizona diner and each dark motel room since, and there was nothing left to decide. Whatever happened in the next 4 hours would happen. I was going to be there for it. They came through the trees from the northeast at around 9 o'clock, and they were not the Hegemony. Millard Cunard, Pirandello's section chief, the administrative center of the faction that wanted the big gun. He arrived with 4 men and an air of institutional authority that I recognized immediately from 20 years in corporate environments, the particular gravity of a man who is accustomed to being the person who determines outcomes. He was polite. Carefully, surgically polite. The politeness of a man who finds it more useful than anger, because it maintains plausible deniability and keeps the other person slightly off balance. He addressed me by Pillbox's operational designation, making clear that he knew I wasn't Pillbox, making clear that he knew I knew he knew, and that none of this mattered because the operational requirement, a face the Hegemony would admit to the exchange, was something I possessed regardless of everything else. He explained what he wanted with the straightforward clarity of a man who has concluded that the situation is already decided. I would walk into the clearing. I would deliver the water. And I would ask for the big gun. The Hegemony's protocol required them to honor the stated preference of the authorized contact, whoever that contact was. All I had to do was say the wrong words in the right voice. Pirandello said, he won't do that. Cunard looked at him with the patience of a man who has already done the math. He said, that decision isn't his to make. Pirandello said, then what happens now? You shoot me and threaten him. Cunard said, that's the approximate shape of it, yes. The shot was a single round to Pirandello's left arm, placed with the precision of someone who wanted him incapacitated rather than dead, because a dead Pirandello was a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. He went down behind a tree in a way that looked like going down but wasn't, and I heard sounds that told me he was continuing to work, and I understood with sudden and total clarity that whatever I did in the next few seconds was the thing that was actually going to matter. I stood up. Not bravely, not with a clear plan. My body simply moved before my brain had completed the sentence it was trying to formulate, and I was standing with the case in my hand looking at Cunard, and I heard my own voice, steadier than I had any right to, say, if you kill him, you get nothing. Cunard looked at me. The patience was still there, but something behind it sharpened. I said, the Hegemony's protocol isn't just about the face, it's about the condition. The contact has to arrive voluntarily, without coercion. That's in the foundational agreement, 7 years of relationship building, It's in the first document Pillbox filed when the contact was established. They established it deliberately. They don't trust a species that responds to everything with force, and they built a verification mechanism into the handshake. If I walk into that clearing with a gun at my back and a dead man behind me, they will know. They see everything, you know that. It's in the briefing materials you've clearly read. They'll see it, and they'll leave, and neither option gets delivered. And in 5 years everything on this planet is gone, including whatever strategic value you thought you were protecting. I was making approximately 60% of this up. The rest I had absorbed from Pirandello's descriptions of the Hegemony's character and behavior over 4 days of close quarters, and I was translating it in real time into the language of someone who had spent 2 decades explaining to frightened people why one choice was survivable and the other wasn't. That's what the insurance work actually is at its core. Not paperwork, not actuarial tables. Sitting across from a person in a bad moment, and finding the language that makes the right choice feel real and immediate, and the wrong choice feel like what it is. Cunard looked at me for a long time. He was working something through. I could see it. He was not a fool. He was not a cartoon. He was a man who had built an entire rational structure on a foundation that was wrong, and the structure was sound, and the question he was asking himself now was whether I had introduced an element that his structure hadn't accounted for. He hadn't. I was gambling, modeled the consent protocol as a hard constraint. He'd modeled it as a preference. The shot came from the northeast, from the direction they hadn't fully covered. A single round. Cunard went down. His 4 men dissolved in a 30-second engagement that I have no clear memory of, only the sounds and the cold air and the smell of old leaves, and then silence. The woman from Pittsburgh. I never learned her name. I never tried to, because some things you learn not to ask, and she was clearly something you didn't ask about. I stood in the clearing's edge with my ears ringing, and the case in my hand, and the last orange light of Friday going long through the hardwood canopy above. Pirandello came out from behind the tree, moving carefully with his arm pressed against his side. He looked at me with the expression that had finally resolved, not the carpenter's look, not the tactical assessment, something that had been underneath both of those all along and had finally come fully to the surface. He looked like a man who had been surprised by something. He said, "That was good work." I said, "I made most of it up." He said, "The best arguments usually are made up in the moment, because making them up means you're actually thinking." He walked me to the edge of the clearing. 40 meters of old grass in a rough oval, a granite outcrop on the far side as a landmark, the trees holding the dark back from the perimeter. It was about 8 o'clock, 4 hours. He said, "You go in alone." I said, "How will I know when they arrive?" He said, "You'll know." I said, "What do I say?" He was quiet for a moment, then he said, in a voice that was quieter than I'd heard from him, the voice of a man who has stopped performing efficiency for an audience, "You say you're whoever you are. Don't try to be Pillbox. Don't try to be anything that makes sense in the context of this operation. Just say who you actually are and why you're actually here." I said, "An insurance salesman from Glendale." He said, "Yes, who drove 3,000 miles because the world needed someone too and there wasn't anyone else available. Tell them that." I walked into the clearing. I have tried many times to describe the 4 hours that followed, and I cannot do it adequately. It was the most solitary time I have ever spent. Not lonely, solitude and loneliness are different animals, and I have learned to tell them apart. Just alone, in the specific and total way that you are alone when the nearest other human is 40 meters away, and everything else is darkness and old trees, and a sky full of stars that are completely indifferent to your situation. The grass was damp and the cold came up through the soles of my shoes, and I stood in the center of the clearing because there was nowhere better to stand, with the case in my hands, and I waited. After about an hour I sat down. After another hour I stood up again, because sitting felt wrong, like arriving at an important meeting and putting your feet on the desk. Whatever was coming deserved to find me on my feet. I wasn't thinking strategically. I wasn't rehearsing what to say or building contingency responses or doing any of the things that a person with training would have done. I was just there, in the specific and undeniable way of a man who has run out of other places to be. I thought about my son's baseball stance, which had a hitch in it I'd been meaning to address for 2 seasons. I thought about the way my daughter laughed when something genuinely surprised her, the specific quality of it, the way it was completely involuntary and therefore completely true. I thought about 11 years of insurance work and whether I had done it well enough on balance to matter to the people I'd served. I thought about Pillbox, whose name I didn't know and whose face I wore, who had spent 7 years in the service of this moment and had died before he could complete it. I thought about what it cost him and what it had been worth, and whether those 2 things could be made to balance, and I concluded that they probably could not, and that the work got done anyway, and that this was probably as close to a reliable principle as the universe offered. The stars moved overhead the way stars move when you're watching them imperceptibly, until you stop watching and look again and they've shifted. The cold deepened. The trees were very still. At some point, an owl made a sound somewhere to the east and then didn't make it again. I held the case with both hands and waited with everything I had. At 11:47, the light came from above. Not blinding, not dramatic in the way you might expect drama to arrive on an occasion of this scale. Just a cool white light with something slightly wrong about its temperature. Not wrong, precisely, just not ours. The light source was somewhere above the canopy. It illuminated the clearing in a circle about 10 meters across, and I was standing in the center of it. They came from the light, 2 of them. Pirandello's description was accurate and completely inadequate. They were our height, roughly. The basic bilateral architecture was there, the same structural logic that evolution had converged on independently because it apparently works upright, 2 arms, face organized around the relevant sensory equipment. But the skin was the thing, not a color I had words for, not a texture that existed in my reference library. And the movement, not wrong, not threatening, just profoundly, irreducibly other in the way that only becomes visible up close, the way a very precise translation of a poem still doesn't quite sound like the original. The one in front stopped 3 meters from me. It looked at me. The other was still. The voice, when it came, was in English. I have thought about this many times and reached no conclusions. I have simply filed it in the category of things I don't understand and cannot explain, and have decided not to let that particular file consume too much space. It said, "You are not the one we arranged with." I said, "No, he died, I'm sorry." It said, "We know he died. We were aware of it when it occurred. We have been observing continuously." I said, "Then you know why I'm here." It said, "We know you were selected because your physical characteristics match his. We know you are not a government operative. We know you are a salesman of financial risk instruments from the city of Glendale in the state of California, and that you have traveled across your continent to be here, and that you arrived without physical harm despite several attempts to prevent your arrival." I said, "That last part is mostly down to Pirandello." It said, "We know Pirandello. He is effective. He is at the clearing's edge with a wound in his arm." I said, "Yes. He understood the protocol. He didn't come in." It said, "And yet you are here." I said, "Yes." Something in the thing it had instead of eyes held me for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable hold. It was the way a very careful person looks at something they're trying to understand completely before they speak. It said, "Why?" I said, "Because the ocean is dying. Because my daughter did a school project on it and she asked me if it was as bad as the article said, and I told her we were working on it. I didn't know then what working on it looked like, but this is apparently what it looks like. And I'm here, so I'm working on it." Several seconds of quiet that lasted longer than several seconds. It said, "The one we arranged with chose the restoration option. He chose it consistently, across 7 years, under significant pressure to choose otherwise. He told us your species was worth preserving because it was capable of choosing correctly when the cost of doing so was real. I said he was probably right. We're also capable of the other thing. You saw that tonight. It said, we saw that tonight, yes. We have been observing for some time. The capability for the other thing is not a surprise. I said, and yet you made the offer. It said, we made the offer because the capability for the correct choice is also real. We have seen both. The offer was an occasion for choosing. I said, what did you observe tonight? What did we choose? It said, the people who wanted the destructive option employed destructive means in attempting to acquire it. The person who wanted the restoration option stood in a clearing in the dark and told us who he was without embellishment. We observe this and find it consistent with the pattern that made the original offer meaningful. I opened the case. The glass was plain, an ordinary drinking glass, the kind that comes in sets of 8 and eventually loses members to attrition over the years. I held it out. I said, a glass of water from a planet that is trying to choose correctly. That's everything we have to give you. That's the whole of it. It reached out. The hands at that proximity were the thing that finally found the gap in my composure, not threatening, not grotesque, just so completely not what I was prepared for that my nervous system registered a complaint. It took the glass. It didn't drink. It held the glass and looked at it for a long moment, and then it looked at me, and whatever it was communicating in that look I have spent years trying to translate and will probably never get quite right. It said, the restoration begins in 48 hours. It will require 2 years to reach full effect. Your ocean will be clean. I said, thank you. It said, we will continue to observe. I said, I know. I hope what you see is worth watching. It said, we believe there is a reasonable probability of that. The light went. I was standing alone in an empty clearing in Virginia at midnight with an empty case and eyes that had gone wet at some point without my noticing. I stood there for a while. Then I turned around and walked back to the tree line. Pirandello was against a tree, arm wrapped, looking at me. The woman from Pittsburgh was somewhere behind him. He looked like hell. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had done everything right and paid the expected cost. He said, well. I said, we got the good package. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them, said, what did they say? I said, they said they'd been watching and they found tonight informative. He said, informative. I said, I think that's the ceiling for us. He almost smiled. Small, brief, real. I'd been watching his face for 4 days and I knew the genuine article by then. We walked out through the dark trees, he and the woman from Pittsburgh and me. Through old hardwood and cold air, and a sky showing stars through the canopy breaks. We didn't talk much. There wasn't a great deal to say that the silence wasn't already saying better. Pirandello moved with the careful economy of a man managing a wound that he has decided not to let slow him down, which was completely consistent with everything I had observed about him over 4 days, and which I suspected was completely consistent with everything he'd done for 15 years. The woman from Pittsburgh moved like someone who had been in woods at night many times before, and had long since stopped finding it noteworthy. I moved like a man who had just done the strangest and most important thing of his life, and hadn't yet decided what to do with that information. I thought about Pillbox, about a man who had spent 7 years going to meetings in undisclosed locations and building something real with something incomprehensible, motivated by the simple and radical belief that the species was worth the investment. He had been right. He had been killed for being right, which is a thing that happens, and that does not make the rightness less real or the being killed less wrong. I thought about the fact that he would never know whether the exchange had completed. That the thing he'd given 7 years and ultimately his life to had come down to a Glendale insurance salesman holding a glass of water in a Virginia clearing, and that it had worked, and that he would never know. I thought about Cunard, about the men who had decided that the weapon was the rational choice, who had built a complete and logical structure on a foundation that was wrong. The thing that stayed with me wasn't their failure, it was their competence. They had been good at what they did. The leak, the interdiction, the staging of assets across 3 states, all of it was well executed, professional, the product of serious capability applied to a serious purpose. They had simply applied it to the wrong thing. I thought about all the ways a person could be genuinely skilled and use that skill in the service of an answer that was wrong at the root, and I thought about whether there was a way to know, in advance, which category you were in. I didn't come to a conclusion. I don't think there is a way to know in advance. I think you just have to keep asking yourself the question and being honest about the answer and being willing to change course when the answer changes. The car was where we'd left it. Pirandello got in on the passenger side, which was the first time in 4 days he'd let me drive, and I took it as a more direct statement of trust than anything he'd said. I thought about my daughter. I thought about my son. I thought about the world they were going to live in, the ocean that would be clean in 2 years, the thing that wouldn't happen now. I thought about the fact that they would never know any of this, that the story I was living would remain permanently outside the visible history they'd grow up inside of, and that this was correct and right, and was in fact the only version of the outcome that felt like it had been worth the cost. We drove east through the Virginia night toward the first morning that came after all of it, and I watched the stars through the windshield, and felt the specific quality of exhaustion that belongs only to people who have finished something they weren't sure they could finish. And I let myself, just for a moment, believe that it had been enough. The ocean cleaned. 2 years, as promised. The modeling teams quietly issued the all-clear, and the world received the news without fully understanding what it meant, which was fine. Some things are better explained in the aggregate rather than in the specific. My daughter went into marine biology. I watch her explain her work at the dinner table, the chemistry of deep water systems, the recovery patterns in ecosystems that should have been past recovery, the organisms that return to ranges they hadn't occupied in decades. And I can barely follow the terminology, but I know what it looks like when someone has found the thing they were supposed to be doing. She has that look in a way I never quite managed in insurance, and it is one of the most straightforwardly good things I have seen. She doesn't know what I did. I decided early, and have not revisited the decision, that there were personal reasons beyond the official ones to leave that particular story untold. Something about the difference between a true thing and a necessary thing. She found her work because the ocean was there to study, and the ocean was there to study because of a series of decisions that led to a Virginia clearing on an October night, and none of that needs to be visible to be real. The best work often isn't visible. That's one of the things I learned from 11 years of insurance and 4 days of something else entirely. Pirandello and I still talk. Not often. He's not built for the sustained maintenance of connections, and his work makes it harder still. But on certain dates, in a certain channel I have no official reason to have access to, a few words arrive. Never elaborate. He's not an elaborate man, but he shows up, which I understand now is the thing that matters and the only thing that has ever mattered, and which is harder than it sounds for the people who are actually capable of more than showing up. He could do extraordinary things. He chose, on the most important night, to stop 40 meters from the clearing and let an insurance salesman walk in instead. I think about that choice sometimes. I think it was the bravest thing he did that week, and it was not the thing that looked like bravery. I went back to Glendale. I coached Little League through the end of the season badly as before, and at some point during those last few games, my son's batting stance corrected itself in the way that stances sometimes do when the player simply grows into them rather than being taught, and I counted that as a small personal victory, even though I had nothing to do with it. I had a long conversation with my wife that was overdue by about 2 years, and that led, over the following months, to a series of changes that needed to happen, some of them painful in ways I had been avoiding, and some of them better than I had expected. The house was medium-sized, and the street was medium, and the insurance work continued as it had, clients and policies and the slow accumulation of small protections against large uncertainties. The difference was not visible from outside. It was the difference of a man who has stood in a clearing and said who he was without apology and been found sufficient. Not exceptional, not heroic in any way that the word is normally used. Sufficient. The beings of an incomprehensible civilization had looked at an ordinary insurance salesman from Glendale and concluded that what they were looking for was present in sufficient quantity in an ordinary human being who showed up because someone had to. I think about that when the news is bad, which is frequently. When the other thing is very visible. I think about what the Hegemony said. We observe this and find it consistent with the pattern that made the original offer meaningful. They made the offer because the pattern was real, not because it was dominant. It doesn't have to be dominant. It just has to be present and genuine, present enough to tip a thing when things need tipping. The counterweight doesn't have to be as heavy as the weight. It just has to be real. I have a particular policy I close more often these days. Environmental restoration coverage, relatively new product, growing market, reasonable premiums given the actuarial trajectory. My clients buy it because they're worried about the world their children will live in. I help them understand the risk modeling, the probability structure, the specific and concrete reasons why the bet is worth making. I tell them what I have come to know. The odds of survival depend entirely on which option you choose when the options are presented. I have seen what choosing correctly looks like. I know what it cost, and what it cost is less than what it was worth. That's the whole of it.